Welcome back. My name is Jack Burgess. This time I want to talk about something a little bit different. In my layout video, toward the very end, I talked about a car that I had built, an observation car, partly because I didn't think I would ever have a chance to share that model with people. Now that we've been doing these videos, I have a chance to talk a little bit more about it and also give you some background about how I researched it, what's actually happened in the last 20-some years. We'll start with a couple prototype photos. This photo was taken by a longtime friend of mine, Bob Leno, who worked on the YV in 1942, a good photographer. This photo was taken actually by Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg. I think that was probably about 44 or so. That's when they were there. And this photo I like because this is Al Rose talking to Guy Clemens, who started working on the YV in 1923. And Al was a fan of the YV. I actually met him because I had started meeting some rail fans after I decided to model the YV, and one of them suggested I talk to Al Rose. About that time, Trains Magazine came out with a request by readers to submit contact information about railroad historical societies. So there was none for the YV, so I created my own historical society, Yosemite Valley Railroad Historical Society, and it was published in the magazine. And then Al Rose wrote to me. I don't really think he said, what were you thinking? But I did get a chance then to go down and see him, and he had, in addition to a lot of black and white photos, he had about 130 color slides that he had taken. And so the very first trip down there, he's showing me one picture after another. He had a kind of remote control and a wire to control it. The next time I went down, he showed them to me again, and I would say, oh, stop, back up. So finally he just gave me the remote, And then what I would do is, as soon as I got in my car to come home, I would write notes. I learned that the backside of whistle posts were this color or whatever. So we became pretty good friends. I learned right off the bat I could not ask for copies of photos. People had done that, rail fans had asked him for photos and then published them without credit. So after he passed away, his widow asked if I would write a book about the YV or if I had thought about that, and I had, and now I have all of his photos, black and white and color. So here's the model. Back in 1976, when I was thinking about building this model, I learned that the car was still in existence up in Wairika. And when the YV was abandoned, the owner of the Wairika Western Railroad, which was only a 7.5 mile long railroad, bought it, took it up to Wairika, and that's where he would stay when he would go up for a weekend to enjoy running trains on his layout. And so my wife and I went up there, and by then it had been turned into a diner. It actually been parked on a long spur. A freeway was being built. They just cut the track in half, left the car on the spur, took the trucks off finally, and we sat on the observation end even though that was completely enclosed. So these pictures were taken about in the 1970s. In talking to Al Rose about my goal to build this model, he gave me these plans. There's actually 4 sheets. These are actual plans from Hicks that built the car. So they were invaluable, except you will notice they only show the framing. They don't show what the outside of the car looked like. And so I didn't know the size of the windows, size of the doors, and all that kind of stuff. So back then, before the internet, National Model Railroad Association sent out a booklet every year to every member, and it listed the address and maybe telephone number of every modeler that was a member of the organization. Nowadays, no way would you let somebody do that, but I found a guy that lived in Wairika and sent him a letter and asked him to measure the windows, how far from the bottom of the car to the windows and so forth, stuff I needed. And then I took the Hicks plans and that information and drew up my own plans. So here are my plans. This is O-scale. And the interior was pretty easy because the seats were shown on the Hicks plans. So my thought was to photo etch all these parts. And I found in the yellow pages, which is what you did before Google, a person up in a city north of us, maybe 30 minutes away, that's what he did. He did photo etching as a job. And I think part of that might have been electronics in the early days, photo etching boards or whatever. And so I gave him the plans that I needed, and he didn't charge me. He thought it was really neat to photo etch something other than what he was always doing. And so for the sides, I needed to have the entire side and then an inside, because it's going to be different, and then a spacer between those two. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 6 of the sides plus the ends. I also had him photo etch the windows. I didn't realize I had these spare parts until I was looking at stuff to do this program, but you can tell the photo etching is very, very clean. Maybe 10, 15 years ago, I got a photo etching kit to do some photo etching for one of my models. It was nothing like this. This is professional, high-end photo etching. So that let me have working windows. They slide up and down. The glass is microscope glass, so it's actual glass. So back here, the railing is all photo etched. The gate's open, the trap door's open, the door's open, so forth. So once I got the sides, I still needed to add the V-grooves on the sides, that is on the prototype. So I came up with a method of doing that, of painting the car, scribing through the paint, and then etching in the groove myself. So here's a jig that I did because I needed to make the scribes even. Every single one had to be the same width as the other one. So this jig let me do both sides at the same time. Here I painted the sides green just so you can see which ones are the sides. My machinist square is orange, and down here at the bottom I have some 2-inch scale thick pieces of strip wood. So that will give me 2-inch wide scribes. So what I would do is I would take my square, pull it down so it was touching the wood, scribe, and then take out a piece of wood and scribe again. It took me 6 hours to do this, doing both sides at the same time, and I still had to do the ends. So then I cleaned off the paint and I was ready to start soldering things together. So at the time I did not have interior photos of this car. I have them now because Al Rose took them and I didn't get those until I was doing my book. But what Al told me was in the first class section, which is here in the back, it was cool wicker seats. But I didn't realize that they were movable seats. The Hicks plans just show some seats that look like they were fixed. But I'll show you in a minute what we're talking about. So for these seats, I made a master out of styrene, made a rubber mold, and cast them out of Cerobin, which was a very popular low temperature melting metal. There was a lot of people that were doing little castings like today you would do 3D prints and have them printed. Cerobin was the go-to at that time. So and then on the second class section, they were just fixed seats. Here's a couple photos of the inside of the car. Both photos are of the first class section. In this first photo, you can see the wicker seats, and you're looking forward from the back end of the car. The second one, the photo's not very good, but it looks toward the platform end of the car, and again, you can see the wicker seats. Here's a picture looking from the rear platform at the track we've just passed. This was taken by Bob Leno in 1942, and you'll notice there is a no smoking sign on the back railing. Several years ago, my wife and I were at a National Model Railroad Association convention, and at the trade show, there are vendors there selling railroad artifacts and so forth. And my wife was interrogating one guy. She gets to the point, do you have any YV stuff? And he said he does, but he didn't bring it because the convention was back east. And I started telling him what I was doing, my layout and so forth. And he said, I actually have a sign from the observation car, and this is it. And so he said, I'll mail it to you, which he did at no cost. And that is the sign that you saw in the photo a minute ago. So I was told that the floor was covered with a tightly woven carpet. And I thought a long time about how I was going to do that. So what I finally did is I took some cardstock, sprayed Floquil from about 6 to 8 inches over it so that the Floquil would dry before it hit. And it would be little bitty microscopic bubbles. You couldn't touch it. You couldn't blow on it, anything else. Once that was done, then I sprayed it with another coat of Floquil, the red color, and that gave me the texture of the carpeting. Since I could not afford to go, a friend of mine, Bob Brown, who edits the Narrow Gauge and Shortline Gazette, took my model to the 1976 National Model Railroad Association. It took first place in passenger cars. Wasn't the best score I've ever had, but at that point, I'd only been back into model railroading for 10 years. Getting back to the 330, which was in Wairika, my wife and I went up there in the early 1990s to have lunch there again, and the car was gone. I talked to somebody that was next to it, and they said, oh yeah, they've moved it down the street, and it's in the city corporation yard. So we went down there to see it, and here's a photo of what we saw. It looked terrible. In those days, you would get butter to go on your bread, and it would come out a little piece of cardstock or plastic or wood or something, and those were all over the floor. It had been sprayed different colors. It was terrible. And one thing we noticed was that the railing at the back of the car was missing. So we had been told that the city of Wairika owned it because the owner of the car sold it to them and or gave it to them. So we went to City Hall and found out where that owner lived or worked, and went to meet him. I had a little company that distributed gasoline, and walked in and told him our interest in the YV and so forth, and asked him what happened to the railing. And he shows it, the railing. He kept the railing off the car, and he had it in his office. Then when we got home, I started sending him Christmas cards, giving him updates on my layout, what I was building, just so he remembered that I was a real fan of that railroad, hoping that he would eventually give me the railing. He had a girlfriend that lived down here in the Bay Area, right across the bay from where we live. And when I learned that, I said, next time you come down to see her, why don't you let me know ahead of time and you can see my layout? Well, apparently he told the girlfriend all of this. And she said, why don't you just give it to him? And he did. So I ended up with the railing, which I had on the deck for a long time until the next step in the project. In 1995, the city attorney called Al Rose and asked him if he knew anybody that might want the remains of the 330. He called me and told me about it, and of course I didn't want it. And I told a friend of mine that had been modeling a fictitious railroad, wasn't very happy with it. He switched to modeling the YV and really got into it. He said, we'd like to go see it. And I told him how bad it was, and he insisted. No, he and his wife wanted to see it. So I drove him up there, and I didn't realize that 4 months later, he and his wife went back up there, spent the entire weekend cleaning up the interior, getting the paint off as well as they could, and at the end of the weekend, decided to buy it for $1. Then on August 24th, 1995, the car was moved, and that was the 50th anniversary of the last run on the YV. I was up there to help them, and then we also had a person from the Nevada State Railroad Museum there helping us. We jacked the car up, dropped it a couple times, finally got it high enough for the trucker to roll his trailer back in. And remember, this is a 60-foot long car. And he backed all the way up, and I said, wow, that is really good. You're only an inch off being centered. He pulled the trailer out again and got it exactly in the middle. Dropped it down. We took off late in the afternoon, and I had my van, and I was following right behind the truck with the car on it because all the roofing materials started coming off, and stuff was just splattering all over. We were an hour into it, and two girls in a convertible passed me and cut inside in front of me to get right behind the 330. That stuff was then going into their convertible. So the car got down here the next day. Wes rented space at a place that people were storing campers and the truck they were always going to restore and so forth. Their goal was to restore it to its original operating condition, which meant replacing a side sill that had been cracked. They actually dropped the car when they were moving it down the street in Wairika, and they dropped it right in front of the emergency entrance to the hospital. They finally got it back up and finished it, but that broke that sill. They also had to completely remove the roof and replace it, replace all the brake system that was gone, and also find a pair of trucks for it. Then in April 2005, Wes got permission to move the car to Niles Canyon Railway. And I think there was a condition that they would take a private car, not something that they owned. You could have it there if it was in operating condition within 3 or 5 years, something like that. In early 2007, a PLA member and a supporter of the 330 project asked Wes if he could get married on the rear platform of the car. And part of that, what he wanted to do is have a drum head made that said, "Just married," and also have another drum head made that replicated the actual drum head that was on the 330 when it was in operation, and give that to Wes. He also let it be known that the person that was going to build these drum heads would also do an extra drum head of the 330 for anybody that wanted to pay for it, and they were about $300 or so. So I took on the job of figuring out what the drum head should look like. And this is a photo, probably the best photo I have of the car, and you can see the drum head on the end of it. If I zoom in, you can see that it says Yosemite Valley, and then something's in the inside of that. And I kept thinking, what would that be? It looks like a picture, but I could not figure out what it was. And I thought about it for a long time, and I finally realized that it is Valley View. And Valley View is named because of this. This is a brochure from the YV, and when you came into the valley, even when the train was there, you had to take a bus to get into the valley, and this was your very first view of Yosemite Valley. So that's the picture that they used. And here's a better traditional type photo of Valley View. So with that, what I did is I found a picture on a postcard of Valley View, scanned it, and made up the drum head. And then, of course, we had to buy a drum head, and here's our drum head. I included a drum head on my model, but I didn't have that information at the time, so mine just says Yosemite Valley, nothing in the center. But I then talked to these guys, and they took my artwork that was used to make the drum head that's on the 330 now and produce an H01 and an O scale. And I'll tell you more about the O scale a little bit later. So the first run of the 330, but not for the public, was in April 2006. Here's another photo. You can see there's a lot of work that remains. Here's an interior photo of the 330 during that trip. You can see that we all sat on the outside platform. All of his tools were there, his saw, all that stuff when he was working on the exterior. Since 1997, a group of people that like the YV get together each year. We hike portions of the right-of-way. We've been to the top of the inclines. We've actually helped repaint Caboose 15, which is up at El Portel on display, so forth. So in 2007, I wanted to have a special event because that would have been the 100th anniversary of the very first passenger train running from Merced to El Portel on the real YV. May 15th was a Tuesday, so on Saturday and Sunday we went up to El Portel. We invited all the people that lived there to come out. We actually took a YV hand car up there, a pump car, and some panel track and let them pump the car. I took photos along with me and walked around the area and told stories about what buildings had been there, buildings that were still there, and so forth. On Tuesday, we set up a trip to run the car on Niles Canyon Railway. I asked Wes if they would be willing to do it, and he checked and he says, oh yeah, but he didn't tell me how much it was going to cost. And I asked him several times. He said, oh, it's a special event, so forth, an educational event, that's it. And they're not going to charge you. And they didn't. So we set this up. We had the 330 and another passenger car and the Yosemite Valley RPO car in the contest hauled by steam. And so I could invite 100 people. And I did. I invited Bob Brown, the editor that I mentioned earlier. He was there. I asked rail fans that were still around. They came. Al Rose had passed away by that time, but his wife and her current husband, they came, so forth. So here we are loading guests at the Niles Canyon Railway Depot in Snow. That was at the east end of the line. Here is one of the several photo stops. It was an amazing day because I was in charge of the event. And so train crew members would come to me, or the conductor would say, okay, now what do you want to do? Well, let's do a run-by. And he would say, where do you want to do it? Well, you pick. So we had several run-bys. We ran back and forth several times. Here's the contest itself with the steam engine on the front. Here's a photo of guests inside the 330. Wes is the one on the left. My wife Jackie is on the right. Here's a view from the open platform end. There's the railing that I had and gave to Wes decades ago. My wife insists that I told him it was on loan. So if his project failed, I got my railing back, but it's on the car now. Riding on that back platform, it was really easy to figure that you were back in 1939 riding on the real car on the railroad. Even the scenery was typical of what's up in the Merced River Canyon. Here's a final run-by shot and a shot with Wes and his wife on the rear platform. At that point, it had only been 12 years since they bought that car for $1. So while the exterior of the car looks great, there was still a lot of work to be done on the interior, as you can tell from the previous photo. So here's a video that was shot several years ago. Wes has got the first class section completely done, and he's talking about the work to be done.
Hi, welcome aboard the YV330. This is a restoration project that my wife and I, Claudia, have been working on for, well, since 1995. So we found out about this car. It was up in a little town of Wairika in Northern California. And as fate would have it, our friend Jack Burgess invited us to come up and have a look at it, saying it might be destroyed. We decided to save it, and the rest is history. So if you look at this car, you're looking towards the front end here. And back here would be a men's bathroom on this side and some closets on that side and seating all the way through here. There's a couple of funny stories when we were first getting the car, and it was a wreck. We call them chicken coops. There was a door leaning up against that, where that front stained glass window is there. It was leaning up there, and it just looked like the most decrepit thing. I was about to throw it out. My wife said, well, I think that might be original. Well, as it turned out, it is that front door, and it had a beautiful Hicks Locomotive and Car Works, the guys that built this car, logo on it. So it was kind of cool. This car was used as a diner in Wairika, and it served that for many years. Apparently soldiers in Vietnam came back and wanted to come here and have a hamburger, as they'd heard about it from their friends. So the funny thing is, it's had ceiling panels that went across here to kind of hide the clear story, because they didn't need it as a restaurant when they were using it. And so we were taking these ceiling panels down prior to moving it, and from right about here, when I started taking it down, my wife goes, oh my God! And a big meat cleaver dropped out onto the ground. So it's pretty funny stuff. So it's a pretty sensational car. It's come a long ways from when we first got it, but you can see it's got a lot to go. So let's go up to the first class section, see what it's going to be looking like. So the first class section is a lot more complete right now. And as the car was built, this actually had no furniture in it per se, no fixed seats in it. It just had wicker furniture. And it did have a neat writing desk back here. This kind of brings up an interesting point about the car's history, is a few important people had ridden on the car. So we're pretty confirmed that President Taft was on the car. In fact, when he used the car to go up to Yosemite, they ended up naming Taft Point for him. So another person that is rumored to have been on the car was Winston Churchill. So this writing desk right here, you'd like to think that maybe one of those guys had penned some thoughts of their time. So we went ahead and restored and took all this stained glass. A lot of this was broken out and it was covered up, but we ended up putting, there's 17 stained glass windows in the car. And there's also 26 of these opalescent glass windows in the clear story. It's quite an elegant car, and this first class section in particular is a showpiece because it had walnut overlaid on the mahogany. So it's taken a little bit of time to go ahead and laminate up all these panels and do all the trim, but we're nearing completion on the first class section. So we can go ahead and we can move on back out here and go out to the rear deck. And this is the rear observation deck, and this is where President Taft, there's a picture of President Taft's party, but alas, he didn't show up in the pictures. Another artifact that was found by our historian, Jack Burgess. And this is kind of reminiscent of the Titanic with the big solarium over the top here with silver leaf. It's kind of a beautiful deck, 10 by 10 feet wide. Actually, during one of our Christmas trains here, we've had 27 people on this rear deck. It's very popular, and it's got the nice appointments here. I particularly love the scroll, which is original stuff. Most of this up here, that's the original stuff. It's got new paneling on top here, but we were able to save a lot of the stuff. In particular, I like having these posts here. They've been guarding this entryway for 100 years or more. So anyhow, it's been a great project. It's been a great journey, and we ain't done yet. So hope you get a chance to come out and see the 330.
Years ago, as Wes was getting this project going and working diligently on it, he asked if he could have my model of the 330 to be on display in the car. And my wife heard that question and said no, because that's her favorite car. And she pointed out that it was actually too small to be seen very well and so forth. So I offered to build him an O-scale model of the car, which I've started getting stuff together on. So here are the trucks. I've got the trucks. I haven't assembled them yet, of course. And here's all the windows and doors and 3D prints. So I need to start getting going on this project. The one problem I got is trying to figure out how to do the roof, but I'll figure that out. I'll do the wicker chairs. They'll be glued to the floor, but there will be the movable chairs. I haven't figured out how I'm going to do those yet. I don't think I can do 3D printing on them, but we'll see. So that is it for this episode. Hope to see you next time.